Okay, thank you so much for your cooperation. Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for the invite. And I mean, it's a pleasure to be discussing such a relevant and timely topic, which is basically the interaction between emerging technologies, economy, trade, and regulation. And I count on an excellent expert of a panel of experts, Ms. Tews, Szymon Zareba, and Migle Laukyte. I think I don't really need to explain why new technologies are so important for the economy and economic growth. Technology is a key driver of economic growth, especially in the current context of demographic decline. So productivity gains from technology will basically determine which countries will be thriving economically speaking in the coming decades. And that's one of the reasons why there is so much geopolitical tensions around who will be dominating emerging technologies. According to some studies, AI on its own will have the potential of boosting GDP growth by more than 7% in the coming decade. And that's only AI. Now think about the disruptive potential of other technologies like quantum technologies. I know that quantum technologies are still in their infancy, but still they could have a very important transformational potential in very, very different industries, ranging from financial modeling to materials industries, for instance. And a clear indicator of how important technologies are for the economy is just the market capitalization of the most relevant firms in the world. Now, the largest companies by market capitalization in the world are big tech companies, by the way, most of them from the US. But technology is not only important for the economy, it's also having a very big impact on trade. I think I don't need to tell you that some jurisdictions are trying to repatriate some global value chains. The previous panel was discussing about semiconductors and how the value chain of semiconductors is very much globalized, and they're like leading champions in every bit and piece of the global value chain. But still there are some tendencies to try to repatriate all those bits and pieces of the value chain into a single jurisdiction. And even there are also expert controls to try to slow down technological progress in some jurisdictions. By the way, what happened with DeepSeek a few weeks ago may have proven that those kind of expert controls are not as effective as one could have initially thought. And then, of course, we have regulation. I'm very passionate about regulation. Regulation has also many risks, and it also creates challenges for companies. What are the risks of regulation? Regulation presents risks even for cooperation between different jurisdictions. So different regulatory frameworks make it very difficult for jurisdictions to cooperate together. And at the same time, if jurisdictions have different regulatory frameworks, it becomes a nightmare for companies, especially for cross-border companies, to operate based on those rules. And all this is even made even more difficult by very different approaches to technologies. So the US is, I would say, maybe this is an oversimplification, but it's a techno-optimist jurisdiction based on the free market, whereas in the EU, we are more based on regulation to protect individual and collective rights, and then we have China, where state control is a must and is more important. So this is where we see that the EU and the US have a complex relationship of competition, but at the same time cooperation, which is very necessary in the current times. So a very important question is what will happen with institutions like the Trade and Technology Council or the Quantum Task Force. And I hope that today our experts will help us shed light into these questions. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor first to Shane, then Szymon, and finally Migle for an initial introduction, and then we will take it from there. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you to the organizers for putting together this amazing discussion. I just loved that first panel. They could have gone on for another hour, and I would have been happy to hear it. It still amazes me that we can get a group of people today to come talk about just chips. I've been in this technology space for quite some time, and we used to take congressional staff out of Washington out to Silicon Valley, and they love to see the gadgets. They love to go to Apple. They love to, when it was Facebook, we would go over there, and then we tell them that we wanted them to go inside a semiconductor chip discussion, which you really can't show them much than just it's sand that becomes this. And they really didn't want to get off the bus. I mean, they just were like, we don't really understand what we're talking about. And now to have these very vibrant conversations. But I also think back then we had ASML and TSMC and all these same companies, but it was very quiet and they really didn't have all these geopolitical issues that we come together now. So it's fascinating to be in these discussions. So as we're all here today, as we're trying to see where we can align US and EU interests on these critical technology areas, such as artificial intelligence, I spend a lot of time in cybersecurity, the development of semiconductor chips, and then the importance of data flow, which is another thing that is, all near and dear to our individual hearts when we think about it as privacy. But we have to think about it from a cross-functional ability of where the data can flow and where it's allowed and who gets to keep the information. These are all very important rules that we need to have not only cooperation, but transparency and an understanding of how these coordination on the emerging technologies come forward. So the key discussions should really focus on ensuring that our regulatory frameworks do not hinder innovation, but instead create an environment where the companies on both sides of the Atlantic can thrive with rules that allow investment to flow on both sides of the Atlantic. So I just wanted to put some key points on some of the emerging technologies that you've heard quite a bit about today, but where we can find, in the case of like artificial intelligence, the regulatory alignment that has been talked about. So the EU AI Act is something that you have recently implemented, and in the US, we work on voluntary guidelines. So trying to find out where we can harmonize in those areas to ensure innovation and addressing ethical concerns are very interesting. And now with DeepSeek, we are really seeing China come to the table and trying to figure out how we work that triangulated relationship. The cross borders on research and development are very important. Those anywhere we can find a joint initiative that brings the U.S. and EU together, as discussed with the Trade and Technology Council, the TTC, to promote shared advancement in critical sectors such as healthcare and finance and defense are really important. The supply chain, which has been much discussed today, and the idea that we have a transatlantic collaboration, so we can't have those keys to understanding we're dealing with a secured AI supply chain, including that data processing that I just mentioned, and the computer power and the cloud-based AI models that will be able to work in the global perspective as we have them now. We already see challenges with where the cloud is being suggested that we break some of the cybersecurity elements when it comes to encryption, and we need to understand the importance that we have a unified front on that. In cybersecurity, in general, just the whole idea that we recognize the importance of cybersecurity and have rules that we all agree to. I go back in my brain, I think it was about 2014, when JP Morgan, the bank, they hold a marathon every year, and it was in 2014, and they didn't think much about giving the contract to a third party to allow them to use the system to create the marathon's information flow, but they allowed them to use get an advance into the JP Morgan banking system, and criminals realized that was a very narrow scope where they could get into JP Morgan's bank through a third party because they were just hosting a marathon. And it was the first time we saw a massive cyber attack on a banking institution, a financial institution. And I talked to the Treasury Department after that happened, and they said, it's just the criminal element figured out there was a delta between, as Sophia was talking about and Lindsay mentioned, where we consider military and then where we consider commercial, defense operations. The commercial entity around banking just really didn't have protection measures together 10 years ago, and that's where we had to kind of realize that we had to get the commercial market together. The other area where we need to focus, especially on artificial intelligence, is workforce and talent development. That is something that and from a transatlantic perspective, we have so much to offer there, because The AI talent gap requires that cooperation and then bringing that into the education process, including funding and the labor market. The policies between the US and the EU will help raise us to another level when it comes to artificial intelligence. There's been a lot of discussion today about quantum, and you have a special place when it comes to quantum here in Barcelona. So the idea of the strategic national investments, the standardizing and interoperability as we move forward with this, as well as the quantum secure cryptography. There's a lot of people concerned about that once quantum is let out, we need to make sure that we know that we can keep things secure, or there's the antithesis of that is that it's going to break everything, and we're prepared for that, as well as scientific collaboration. And then because you're coming into Mobile World Congress, I have to mention that we are continuing to work with 5G and all that comes with that. So the idea of the supply chain resilience, my pad does not want to stay. So we have, we've been working on something called Open Radio Access Network as a combined effort between Europe and the United States to say that there's another path to go forward than choosing mostly Chinese products, but we help them build that area when it comes to that, or in the early parts of late 1990s and early 2000s, and now we've realized that there's security challenges that we have there. So coming together with the Open Radio Access Network has been a vital part of showing a different side of the supply chain. And so those of you who are at Mobile World Congress this week, I'm sure will continue to hear a lot about that, as well as the idea of smart infrastructure and how we make sure that we have the elements that we need to be locked down as we are all partners with each other, because we have recently in the United States seen that we've had huge challenges with something called Salt Typhoon that allowed people into the infrastructure, and it had been in the infrastructure for quite some time. So if we're going to have partners with each other, we need to make sure we can trust everyone's networks as we work together. So those are some quick highlights, and I'm really looking forward to this evening's discussion.
Okay, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and letting me the opportunity to present here a few excerpts, just a glimpse of our research at the Polish Institute of International Affairs as regards the possible future of the transatlantic relations in the near future and maybe a little bit more distant. So first I would like to start on a maybe a less positive note than the other speakers. Because what we concluded from our analysis, which is probably not the quantum physics, is that, the President Donald Trump's and his advisors and also supporters, such as the Project 2025's approach to the EU, complicates the reality of transatlantic cooperation. And I'm referring here in particular to the statements such as that the European Union was formed in order to screw the United States, or the possible imposition of tariffs on various products from the EU, like 20% tariffs on cars and all other things, as announced yesterday. Of course, these are just the examples. But so therefore, in our view, the key challenge for the euro in the short term may be rather to minimize losses as regards what we have already achieved in our cooperation, and to maintain the current level of cooperation. Nevertheless, we believe that the EU should not give up on deepening its relations with the United States in line with, for example, the priorities of the Polish presidency of the EU Council in 2025. And the EU should emphasize and clearly communicate to the US administration that, these are the US and the EU are the two largest economies in the world. They are key trading and investment partners, and, a case when one partner is hurt badly will definitely adversely affect both sides in the end. Whereas, in fact, what it needs also to be stressed is that, both partners share a similar approach to the market economy, to private property, investor protection, to have a similar culture and consumer preferences. They have also established after the Second World War the common global economic governance system. So, in fact, their strategic interests coincide in the long term, and I believe this is what we need to, as the EU, to convince the United States about. As regards the possible ways of cooperation, as I said, well, our conclusions were that, well, we need to start modest, at least taking into account what has recently been happening and, well, the many announcements of the current administration. Among our ideas, because I won't be able to present all of them here, were, for example, the development of common economic security standards in supply chains, particularly in strategic sectors and those involving critical infrastructure. That could be done, for example, within the TTC already mentioned. Also, a creation of a new format for the exchange of information on companies and investments that could pose a threat to the economic security of the EU and the US and to the global value chains in which these companies, the companies of both partners, are involved based on existing FDI monitoring mechanisms. We've been also discussing the possibility to focus on issues such as the interoperability of technological solutions and creation of common standards, probably also within the TTC, in the fields such as the 6G communications, green technologies, including electromobility, recycling, energy storage, and so on, because we believe these are, let's say, the standards which can be created in such a way, and the interoperability, well, is to the benefit of all sides, and we see it as a non-political issue and an issue benefiting everyone, particularly also some of the so-called tech bros, such as Elon Musk, because of his involvement in Tesla, for example. What is more, we've been also thinking about the possibilities to still pursue some regulatory cooperation, such as the transatlantic regulatory cooperation on small modular reactors, because, well, this is a very interesting and important technology, for example, particularly for Poland, which looks forward to it, and that could be done between the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission and national regulators, which are associated in the European Nuclear Safety Regulators Group. So the meetings between this group and the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission could be possible in order to foster this cooperation. And finally, well, of all these, well, small glimpses, there is the possibility or the idea to open new dialogue with the US on the transfer of personal data to that country, which could be based on the current EU-US data privacy framework, of course, as long as it is not annulled by the CJEU, well, after another complaint lodged by Mr. Max Schrems, who does it, let's say, regularly. These are, let's say, some ideas for the, let's say, closer future. As regards a more distant future, we've been thinking about a possibility of a common stance towards China between the United States and the European Union. And this is interesting because, as far as I remember, the previous panel, I've heard that there is a kind of a change in the thinking of the German elites, political elites, that is very welcome. In our view, well, such a common stance would be beneficial also for the US and the EU in the long term, taking into account the so-called Russia-China nexus, which has been, well, very well demonstrated in the war in Ukraine. On the other hand, also the concerns regarding the safety of navigation and so on in the South China Sea, which is more of the US interest, but still is also important for the EU. And also taking into account many economic issues, such as, for example, unfair market practices, including subsidization, restricting access to the Chinese market for external entities, using forced labor, disregarding product safety standards, forcing technology transfer, stealing intellectual property. As I've mentioned, well, both partners share common values, and, well, the practices of China, which in this regard violate many of these common values, you know, that both either the human rights or the rule of law and many others. So that would be beneficial, but of course, in order to make it possible, it would be necessary to tighten the European Union's course towards China in the economic and technological sphere, and, well, possibly that would need would require coordination of the use of trade instruments with the United States, such as export controls, and diversifying the supply of critical raw materials, also, for example, within the framework of the TTC I've mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking the organizers for this invitation, for giving me the opportunity to share this panel with the speakers, and also for the opportunity to listen to the first panel, which was really very, very interesting. And I already see that this one, at least thanks to my colleagues, it will be very, very interesting as well. My position on the topic of the US and EU collaboration, cooperation in the trade issues and similar, I look at this collaboration through the regulation of Artificial Intelligence Act, because we have all heard many times and also read this morning in New York Times what the President Trump's position on the EU's politics in general, a little bit, so that the European regulation is basically oriented to damage or basically to damage the US economy and US players. But this is not necessarily so, and I actually don't, as much as President Trump might care about my opinion, do not agree with his vision. Basically, we disagree very much on what the regulation is for, right? So in the US, the vision, at least what many times transcend to us, is that the regulation is a unnecessary burden. It hampers the innovation. It is an obstacle to get rid of. Whereas in Europe, we do not have this stance. We actually do think that the regulation serves for something, right? That it has a purpose, especially in the European Union, where we have different ideals and we have different settings, right? We do think about the welfare state, right? We do have this objective of the human-centric and human-oriented artificial intelligence in this particular case. So this is why when we talk about the Artificial Intelligence Act, we're not saying that we are having the regulation which is absolutely un-innovation oriented. Basically, if you take the Artificial Intelligence Act, you'll see one of the first objectives is the advancement of the single European market in artificial intelligence. And then you can see that the security, democracy, fundamental rights are put on the table. But the basic goal is the single market. So we do want to push forward the innovation. We're really technologically oriented, yet we don't accept the idea that anything is fine and okay as long as it is a technology, right? We are saying simply that within the European Union and in the European Union, there is certain kind of technologies we do not want to accept, we do not want to have, right? And this is why we introduced the risk-based approach, and we say that certain technologies are not welcome, they are not allowed. So this is a message simply to say that it is not true that technology, rains on us because it is made in a certain way, and this is how it is. No, we can direct it. And this is also what the regulations are for, to direct the innovation. And this is, again, one of the reasons why the Artificial Intelligence Act was promoted and approved by the European Union institutions. Another thing which is, I think, important is to understand that without the Artificial Intelligence Act, it is not the alternative to have no regulation whatsoever, but to have 27 regulations. So this is also a difficulty for the market, a difficulty for the companies from the United States, from China, from wherever they are to enter the market. So now, with the Artificial Intelligence Act, we are putting again the idea that, this is how you can enter the European market, where the regulation of artificial intelligence is unified. It is true that in European Union, we have this problem that we put a unique and harmonized legislation, right? The regulation at the European level. But the implementation of the regulation is in the hands of the single state, of the member states, right? And this is where the problems come into play. But again, this is how the European Union is made, and this is one of our struggles that we're trying to deal with. Also, it's a problem with the General Data Protection Regulation and with many other regulations that actually aim to harmonize the single market. Of course, there are many things also that the regulation introduces that shows the idea, underlying idea, that innovation is nevertheless and always one of the objectives of the European Commission and European Union in general. We try to learn from the previous mistakes, and what we had with the General Data Protection Regulation, which was difficult for the small and medium enterprises to comply with, much more difficult than for the big tech, right? Now we try to introduce ways to facilitate this challenge for the small and medium enterprises. We're introducing regulatory sandboxes, right? We're introducing the settings to test in real time and in real world conditions of some of the artificial intelligence applications. So there are many things in which the European Union has understood these difficulties and is trying to address it. And another thing that was usually criticized within the European Union, and many times justly, that we are too risk averse, right? We, as in the previous panel, we were talking about precautionary principles, so that we are always on the part of let's be rather safe than sorry, right? So we are not taking sufficient risks, right? But on the other hand, there are risks we do not want to take, first of all, and as in terms of other risks, and it's also reflected in the artificial intelligence regulation, is that some of the risks we do want to share, right? And this is why we introduce the network of institutions. We do introduce these other instruments that make us distribute the risk and also assume it together in the common engagement. But again, this is to say that differently from what President Trump was saying, that it shows this artificial intelligence regulation is one of those regulations that actually show the adversity of the European Union to the United States. That is absolutely untrue. I don't agree with this. And basically my idea is that there is a lot of room for cooperation. There is a lot of room for common endeavors, for common initiatives. And I think we have slowly started to do that, to advance in this regard. And also, we have also seen that it is for the first time that we have the Commissioner for Trade and Economic Security. So again, the European Union, I think, is showing in all the possible ways that innovation, technological advancement is very important for us as well, and it's not that we're against it. And of course, if we can do it together rather than alone, that would be more than a great start for both. Okay, so I will stop here, and I look forward for the conversation with the rest of you.
Thank you so much to the three of you for these very interesting introductory remarks. I want to take it from where you left it, Migle. Basically, I want to discuss a bit more the impact of regulation with the three of you. So some people say, it doesn't mean that I agree, but some people say that the US innovates, China replicates, and the EU regulates. So I want to know whether you're aware of any innovation that has been hindered in the EU because of regulation. Or, I mean, Shane, you come from the US. Are you aware of US companies, for instance, not launching some specific products in the EU just because of the compliance burden, because of what it would mean, or is everything fine? I mean, we're just exaggerating and EU regulation is perfect.
So the Digital Markets Act has already created challenges where you're going to see certain things that will not be launched in the EU. Part of that, and you mentioned interoperability. I find it interesting that when they talk about competition, that interoperability is part of competition, because the Android system and the Apple system are separate because they're competitive with each other. But what you want them to do is create a baseline where they have to share everything amongst each other, and that completely blows my mind. I can't wrap my head around that because it doesn't work. And it is going to be the beginning of things that you will start to see. They're going to divide up. We're seeing it in South America too, with the Brazilians have certain things where they've said are not allowed. So they just have markets that are for smaller entities of new innovation that they're not going to bring the broad spectrum to these areas where there's heavy regulation. We like what we call permissionless innovation. We like to be able to innovate, and then you'll meet with people, and then you can cater it along the way. But I always say you start with the engineers. The engineers are your engine on this. If you start with the lawyer's job is to say no. They say no all the time. They are the department of no. So if you have engineers and then they realize the only way they're going to get funding, because what people and investors understand is risk. So if the lawyers can show you the risk of what's involved, the engineers will eventually realize there's certain things that are just not going to fly because they're too risk adverse. But if you start with the risk calculation and then tell them to go innovate, it isn't a formula that tends to work.
Okay. Any reactions? Yeah. Simon?
Yeah, honestly, I think that this emphasis on over-regulation in the EU is sometimes exaggerated. It's over-exaggerated in some cases because, for example, when I think about the cases which have been very prominent in Poland as regards some innovative solutions, the two which come to my mind are the first, which was the spin car, so an idea of a car that would be able to rotate in order to park, right? So able to do it very smoothly and without having to turn, right? So that would be a great improvement, particularly in the cities. But the problem was that, in fact, this particular idea did not get enough business support, enough investment from for example, Polish business in this case, right? And in the end, I think like a few months ago, I've seen a similar car being invented, by the Chinese, right? So as the shorts with the Chinese car being able to do exactly that, right? Another case was a new idea how to produce graphene, right? So a very important material, for example, possibly for the new chips production, right? So a Polish inventor, Professor Strupiński, invented a great process which was much, much cheaper than the other ones. But the problem was that he was not able to get enough money in order to commercialize this project, right? In the end, Professor Strupiński emigrated to China, right? And once again, China is trying to make this idea commercialized, right? So in my opinion, the biggest problem of the EU is, let's say, the inefficiency of the capital markets, inability to gather the investment necessary in order for the good R&D, which the EU has, to be commercialized and to be put into practice. And I think this is what also the European Commission has recently addressed, by Ursula von der Leyen, when she declared this new commission to be an investment commission, right? So in my opinion, it's really, really also a very important aspect which is very often neglected.
So it's not so much the regulation, but the lack of funding and of a very specific funding, which is not usually bank funding, but like venture capital, other type of capital. Yes, Migle?
Yes. Yes, I also wanted to highlight that there were times that the American big tech were exporting some of the ideas from the European Union in terms of the regulation. For instance, as concerns privacy, I think Shane has, and all of us have heard about Apple introducing this new function in the iPhone, saying asking its users whether they want to be tracked by the Meta apps, right? And Meta got really a bit, hectic, hysterical about this idea. So many of the privacy-oriented features of the iPhones, for instance, were due to the general data protection regulation. So I think there were some good ideas that the big the US companies could adopt and use. I like Shane's idea about that the law is legal departments are usually no departments, because as far as I knew, they were it depends departments. So I see that on this we are also have different ideas. Also in terms of general data protection regulation, we've seen that in the United States, some of the states have adopted more privacy stringent regulations, like California, Connecticut, I think, and there were many more states doing the same. And also in terms of other initiatives on the Congress level, also President Biden's administration have issued the executive order on the artificial intelligence before Artificial Intelligence Act was approved at the European level. So there were many things that actually we were more aligned, right? We were collaborating on in terms of the regulation. So it's not true that European Union was, issuing regulation as cookies, and the United States were saying that we don't share at least some of the ideas that we had. And it is also another thing, which is I think very, very true, that it's not about the regulation. There are other factors that are not allowing European markets European innovation to, get the best of the opportunities. And this is where the United States are actually showing us great examples. We are talking about the financial support, and it is true that in the United States, the universities, the pension funds can invest in the risky technological innovative proposals, right? This is not what is happening in Europe. We cannot do it. So in certain, of course, there are very serious reasons why we cannot do it, but just to think about it and try to find the way that maybe we could look for the ways to do that somehow, maybe could be a way to collaborate, because there are some great ideas that we might not be getting the best of.
Talking about collaboration, you, Szymon, mentioned several times the Trade and Technology Council in your intervention, and you gave some food for thought as to areas where there could be cooperation. I think that the big elephant in the room is what will happen with the Trade and Technology Council. Some people say that it will be dismantled, others say it will simply not be convened, and it will simply stop working. I know that you don't have the crystal ball, but what do you expect?
Yes, well, that's a very pertinent issue, and on the other hand, it's also a very complicated one. We've been looking into that in our institute as well. And well, what needs to be stressed is that there are several factors which, let's say, affect the possible future of the TTC. First is that it has always been a little bit controversial in the US, particularly because it has been more focused on the technology than the trade part, right? So not only such groups such as Project 2025 criticized the TTC, but also some of the Democrats, right? So that was, well, let's say, this is like the first factor which needs to be taken into account, that it has always been more technology leaning than trade leaning. And that may affect the stance of the current administration towards it. The second thing is that, well, this difference which we have already spoken about, and I think also in the first panel, about the approach to regulation. So the EU striving to create a framework that would limit the undesirable uses of some new technologies, while the US being focused on, particularly under President Trump's role, on deregulation, right? So that's the second thing. And also the situation is not made any easier by, let's say, the importance of tech industry leaders, right? So the so-called tech bros, such as Elon Musk, who, well, has personally disputes with the EU, such as regards the application of the DSA, right? So we have, let's say, concluded that there could be like three, let's say, options in play. The first would be a possible dissolution or, let's say, disoperation of this institution. But, well, in our opinion, a formal dissolution is rather unlikely because of the, let's say, not huge importance of the TTC in the priorities of the current administration and, well, let's say, not very large recognition of this institution in the society. So we probably we think that the dissolution or case like that could only happen if the Trump administration considered the council to be ineffective and incompatible with the priorities of the administration, such as, well, the reduction of climate policy and technology regulation and emphasis on trade policy. But we really expect it rather to be, let's say, to de facto cease its activities in such a case, rather than be formally dissolved. The second option would be a limited continuation of the TTC's activities and the decline of its importance. But in our opinion, such a case is probably the most likely. So probably such a TTC could probably meet less often and maybe at a lower level, but still would be kept. In our opinion, that would be, let's say, the most probable scenario, and well, then the TTC could focus on those issues which are, let's say, of vital interest to the partners, but are not very controversial, such as the interoperability I've mentioned, with, at least in some spheres, such as the joint R&D grants, or, for example, the securing of the supply chains, right? And finally, well, the last option would be to make the TTC more important and, well, to keep it at the current level of representation, for example. We believe that it is not very likely, at least when it comes to making it more important, because, well, still keeping the representation level is still possible. But making it more important would be, well, it would be necessary in order to make it, to first overcome the EU's previous reluctance to transform the council into an anti-Chinese format, right? This has always been stressed by the Commission that it cannot be, well, an anti-Chinese instrument. And in our view, well, that would be necessary in order to make it more relevant. On the other hand, of course, it would probably also be necessary to make the trade issues much more important, a much more important point in the agenda of the TTC, right? So probably, well, that would need the both partners to discuss, let's say, the larger trade policy directions in order to be able to make it more important and to be more valued by the current US administration. And finally, I believe that in order to make it possible, there would need to be an adjustment to the US priorities current, such as, well, the dual-use technologies, the development of AI, 6G, well, quantum, electromobility. Well, that would still need to be streamlined in order to fit these priorities in order to be possible.
Anything to add on
So
yours?
I'll
Yes?
say I think part of the challenge is you're working with people that are very data-driven. So they like metrics, they like information, they need to know what the outcomes are before they walk in the room. And the idea of the TTC is soft diplomacy. You need to know who your counterparts are. When you get into a point where there's friction or a hiccup, you know who to get on a Zoom with or have a phone call, especially when we're both in environments where there's a lot of changing of the people along the way. You need to have that continuation of understanding who you're working with. So it's actually kind of a human element that is going to be a bit of the problem in the beginning until someone can walk back into, let's say, Elon Musk's office and say, here's why it's important. Because the initial idea of it is completely draws a blank for them. They're like, they need that, they want the data points and the metrics before they walk in the meeting. So I think, as somebody who lives in Washington, spend a lot of time in meetings where I don't always know what the outcome's gonna be when I get there, but I'm usually happy that I know who's in the room to contact afterwards. I think that one will be hopefully something that they'll be able to work through.
That's a very important point, but Unfortunately, these are not good times for diplomacy, I'm afraid.
As you heard me say, you start with optimism, right? You have to.
Okay, let's be optimistic, yeah.
Yeah, and Judith, I think I would add on this point, I very much agree that the times are not very, very like diplomacy-friendly times, right? But I think this is the reason why we should try to push forward this Trade and Technology Council, and I very much hope that the Polish presidency, which is coming now, it will actually invest in keeping this channel of communication, because we are losing communication with this strategic partner as the US. And if the Trade and Technology Council can be one of the channels that still is active, and we, I think, simply need to show why it is necessary, what's the benefit of having it, highlight it clearly, because we have a business-oriented president in the United States, and we have to explain why it is beneficial, then I think we can at least keep this channel of communication, because we're losing others.
Fully agree. So, I mean, you were mentioning before, Szymon, that the Commission has made it clear that the Trade and Technology Council cannot be an anti-China focus group or institution or gathering. But there are some instances where I would say that the EU and the US have adopted similar policies vis-à-vis China, and I'm thinking, for instance, about export controls. But my question is here is, was this done free-willingly by the EU? And I'm thinking, for instance, about all the pressure that Dutch company ASML received, and even the Dutch government, to restrict export controls. So how do you see this line of cooperation going forward? Do you think that this can indeed be a line for the US and the EU to cooperate, not only on export controls, but even on outbound investment controls? So this is something that now the European Commission is looking into. A recommendation was even issued in January, following a bit what the Biden administration was doing. So what are your views on these trade defense instruments? Do you think there's a scope there to align?
I believe so, but the problem is that, in fact, the EU's regulation as regards the export controls are still lacking quite a lot, right? For example, as regards the regulation regarding the dual-use technologies, well, in fact, a lot is being left for the countries to regulate. So there are differences between the countries, and this makes the whole regime very much less effective than if it was in practice. On the other hand, I believe that still the coordination is definitely needed in order to, let's say, prevent cases such as the one which has been already mentioned during the previous panel by one of the people in the audience. So the export controls which are not coordinated with the partners, such as the ones introduced by the Biden administration in January 2025, which were a kind of an astonishing move for many partners in the European Union. And honestly, I remember a very striking tweet of one of our Polish top experts in the technology field, who reminded all the people, while looking at this map of the first, second, and third tier countries as regards the GPU exports controls, he reminded the quote by Winston Churchill regarding the Iron Curtain, because in fact the line which was drawn within the EU in fact went exactly there, right? From Stettin in the Baltic Sea to Trieste
Portugal
in the
was
Adriatic.
also in tier
yes,
two.
Of
I
course.
was
Yes, there were some
very
exceptions.
surprised about
you're
that.
Absolutely right. You're absolutely right. There were some slight exceptions. I think Greece also was included, as far as I remember. But the problem is that all of the European countries which have been admitted to the EU after 2004 were, in a blanket way treated such as the tier 2 countries. And this was, let's say, a striking and a very unwelcome development. And it really created a lot of a lot of resentment, unfortunately, towards the US, let's say in the society, because you could really feel this in the X or any other platforms. It was like, a resentment, but also a surprise, right? Because, well, we are an ally and so on, and we cooperate in so many fields, right? And now we are faced with something like that, right? So I absolutely agree that we need to focus on the export controls more and in the coordination, on the coordination between the US and the EU.
Thank you.
You also have just the market forces that ASML's had a lock on this area for very specific reasons. It was designed that way. But China is going to try to bank against that until they can do something as close, if not similar, to the lithography machines. And we may even have technology through the cycle that surpasses what they have. So they can't really rest on their laurels being the only one that does this. And we're helping them be that only company amongst the players, including the big technology companies who chose them to be the company. But they need to continue to stay innovative, and I think we as partners need to help them keep that place until there's a possibility of them getting past.
Please help us. Thank you. Migle, do you have anything to say? No? So now I would like to open the floor to the audience. Do you have any questions?
While we're waiting for a question, this is a bit of a public service announcement. So you reminded me with it was the app transparency, tracking transparency, the ATT that Apple came out with. I'm always surprised when it comes to security. I talk to a lot of student groups that, I download apps on my phone all the time. I read Wired magazine. I think this is going to be the coolest thing I've ever heard of. And then 2 months later, I realize I've never opened it. And then I'll later read an article about how it's just siphoning information right off my phone. So, one of the things when they did the app tracking transparency is it made me realize how many apps, because we're constantly asking for information flow from my phone. And it happened to me today. I was like, what do you mean this doesn't have access? And I was like, what is it? And I'm like, well, I don't want that to have access to that part of my information on my phone. So just keep that in mind as something you might learn today. Think about the apps that you have on your devices.
Thank you. I think we have a question there in the back. Do you have a microphone, please? Si no, apelo. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. Question for Mrs. Tews. Given the national security implications and the defense implications of all these next generation technologies and all these value chains, how realistic is to think that there will be trade?
That there will be trade?
Yes.
I don't. It's not. There's the whole balance of that discussion is difficult because a lot of times what the lever points are in that are not public information. So I'm going to use TikTok. Some favorite conversation point is I spent a lot of time. I don't have clearance anymore, but I have friends who have in the intelligence community, and they just said don't put it on your phone. And I'm like, kind of want to do it. Looks like fun, but you tell me not to do it, I'm not going to do it. I'll be happy with Reels. And then DeepSeek comes out, and for almost a hot second, I wanted to put it on my phone, and I thought, how long have I resisted putting TikTok on my phone, and now I'm going to put DeepSeek on my phone? It seems like even a better tool to just do what I've been told I don't want from TikTok. So I guess that's my way of saying to your question, I don't have a full information flow to understand. It's an asymmetric conversation, I think, in that way, and it makes it challenging for those of us who, we know a lot, but we don't know everything we need to know how that conversation is going to go.
Any further questions? Yeah, please.
Hello, good afternoon to all of you. I'm Marcel Fernandez from Jeff Catalonia, and thank you for sharing your insights. I would like to ask you, how are the European Union and NATO aligning their artificial intelligence defense strategy, and what's the future of that? Thank you.
Well, that's a very difficult question, but very interesting at the same time. Who wants to take it?
Not into defense.
Shane, you look like you want to.
No, there's so many different observations you have to make about different groups, and I have to say that I haven't been focused. I wish Sophia's still here. I'd love to hear her point of view on it, but I've been watching. The one that has been surprising to me was UNESCO. I mean, when UNESCO got involved, I was up in a meeting in New York, and they had all these people show up, and I was like, I'm going to have to get a clue on this one. Like, why is UNESCO interested in this? And then it actually made a lot of sense. They're very worried about with the learning language models how they're going to have certain parts of, especially Africa, they have so many language elements that people are not investing in. Now, the free market army says they'll catch up to that eventually. There'll be a reason they'll want to move that forward. With NATO, again, those are a little bit of those conversations that I work on the economic side of the American Enterprise Institute. The Foreign and Defense Policy team, I'm sure, would have a lot to say about that, but I let them usually be the smart people on that point, so I apologize. I don't have an answer for you on NATO.
Thank you. Yeah, you have an answer.
I don't have answer either, but I just wanted to add to what Shane was saying, that the UNESCO got involved. The Vatican has also got involved.
Early.
Yes, and
They got in
Vatican
really early.
is involved, and Pope also has issued the opinion. So I think who is not involved, we should find who's not involved.
Yeah,
right. So, on the level of the NATO, and it's a very broad question, right? I think when we talk about the artificial intelligence strategy, so I'm not an expert in security either, but I simply think that there are many layers, right? It's cybersecurity, it's military applications. So we are talking about many things, and there is no common. I haven't read about or seen kind of common vision of what we are going to talk about, even because I think the problem in the room with the NATO is whether they're still going to be NATO, right? Because it seems that it might stop to exist, I think.
It's been a question recently. Yeah.
Yeah,
sure.
I remember Chancellor Merz making a point of NATO being non-existent in a half of a year, as far as I remember. I read it a few days ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So any strategy that it might, I think it's about the survival of NATO rather than about the strategies on specific technologies.
Yeah, please.
Thanks. So right now the EU-India TTC, another TTC is taking place. And so I think it's very interesting in this whole de-risking economic paradigm. The US and the EU are finding common ground in moving towards the Indian market, right? Specifically on trade and tech. But India has a record of doing very authoritarian tendencies in regulating internet and shutting down internet service. And so my question is, what are the risks and opportunities of US, EU engaging more in India, by the risking from China? Like, what do we have on the table right now? Thanks.
India is doing a lovely job of positioning themselves as not being China. And so they are winning just on that, right? But there's actually in the last decade, as somebody who's worked from the internet very early on, and the freedom of speech and the ability to have free speech was priority number one at many levels. We've had to kind of delineate from that, and that sometimes is very difficult for me because I think it's so important. But as we've gone to, watched what's going on, in multiple places, we're giving people a little bit of a buy on things that used to be a priority in the negotiations, and part of that is the supply chain management. So that is that economic part of the supply chain has now started to be more prioritized than sometimes what might be freedom of speech or human rights. I'm not saying India on human rights, but other areas. So there's a lot of balanced conversations that need to take place around that.
I would say it also depends on, let's say, the areas of the cooperation which are being picked, right? So I think you could simply identify the areas such really as electromobility, which, do not pose, let's say, some immediate threat for the human rights and other values being challenged, unless, of course, there is like forced labor being used, right, in the factory. But of course, there is a number of technologies which may pose a challenge as regards the values you mentioned. On the other hand, definitely, the cooperation with India could be beneficial because, for example, as regards the reports which I really like made by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. India is definitely one of the key players now, being a leader, in the top 5 in like 43 of 64 technologies, something like that, right? So it's like quite a lot. It's like really, I think, number 4 in the world. So definitely, but really, it depends on the choice of the fields of cooperation. I believe this could still be possible, but would need to be done very prudently.
Okay, yeah, more question?
Hi, my name is Marcel. Thank you for everything that's been spoken about. I just wanted to bring up the fact I have not heard during this panel or the previous one any mention about energy or water usage. And we're talking about AI. So just very simple, in your respective domains and in your private meetings, has this ever come up as a bottleneck? So AI is definitely incompatible with renewable energy, but it's going to be incompatible with legacy coal or oil energy. So how is this ever come up in a priority when you guys go and have your talks in your respective domains? Because I don't know if it was spoken about in the third meeting, but it hasn't come up today, and it is a bottleneck.
So the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, did a piece. I think he just unfortunately, I don't know why he decided to put out the same week as the U.S. election, so it didn't get a lot of play, but it was an op-ed that said we need to start thinking about our energy use, not with the current calibration that we have. Even in the United States, it's really done on a whole idea of like a 1950s, 60s, 70s model of usage of energy. And I mean, so from a whole idea, from a policy perspective, we need to think about, kind of as the Chinese do, they'll think about it in a very much decade, 2 decades, 50 years in advance on how we're utilizing this. We're still very much prioritizing it in a very regional way, which in the United States is how we actually regulate it. So the states regulate it more. I mean, we have certain things that are done at the federal level, but most of it's done as a state priority. So that's one of the reasons why in the United States we don't have, unless it's an industry-driven discussion, you don't hear a lot of like really big discussions, except for, nuclear's having a moment for the moment. So I appreciate that. On water, you think about it, at least, a lot of times things start in areas where water, you're on an area, you go to a river, you go next to an ocean. There's always been reasons why progress needed that as a resource. And so I think we also need to rethink that as well as, where do we place that? Jensen Huang at NVIDIA talks about how we need to be thinking about where we put the data centers closer to the energy source. So, just redesign that as part of the thinking process. We have certain areas, when I took on the train to go into Zaragoza the other day, and you have so much solar, and you have the wind power that's going on there. So it's a perfect place that makes sense for these data centers to go, because you don't lose much in the transmission if you can put the data centers much closer to the actual energy source. So I was fascinated to know that that's going on in that area here in Spain. We're not, at least publicly, talking about the importance of that as much in the United States.
Okay. Do you want to react?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yes, this is a very important question. I think in the first panel there was some mentioning of the green technologies, actually, so of the greening of the technological innovation. So basically, it is a huge elephant in the room, so much so that there are some of the countries that don't even recognize the problem, right? So I think within the European Union, actually, we are very much aware of this. In the Artificial Intelligence Act, there is a part that is actually dedicated to the problem of we want the artificial intelligence, which is not only human-centric, but also environmentally friendly. And there is a huge debate about the green and just transition. What does it mean within the European Union? But again, it is true that many of these initiatives and many of the debates are based on the idea that all of the world should agree on this. And of course, we would not stop just because the others are not doing anything, but it is also difficult to achieve the Paris Agreement goals when the other countries are actually already saying that we are not going in this direction. We do not care, right? So I think it should not stop us because, again, we very much hope that our commitment to the environment will produce this famous Brussels effect. But of course, we are also kind of try to be realistic because well, the world does not seem to care about the environment as much as we would like it to care.
Don't you think, I don't know what happens, don't you think that as technologies evolve, they will become more environmentally respectful? I'm thinking, being a bit provocative, about DeepSeek. I mean, one of the things they claim that is that they did this with less money, but that it's also more efficient energy-wise, which, I mean, honestly, one needs to believe that. But that's what they claim. So as technologies evolve, in principle, one should expect them to become more efficient, not only financially, but also environmentally, right? What are your views on this?
So I think we should not believe, but we should check whether it is really so.
Regulate.
No. Check whether, test. Use science to see whether it's really so or not, because, well, companies claim many things. But within the European Union, I think with the Horizon projects and many others, we do finance, support, and actually ask for the environmental impact of any of the tech projects. So we're actually very, very aware and attentive to the impact, and ask for the innovation oriented towards the Paris Agreement and the green and blue technologies that we want to have.
Okay, I think we are already past, it's almost 25 to 8, so thank you so much. They deserve a very big round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your excellent views with us, and now we will hear the closing remarks. Thank you.